Officer Lee somehow stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his police uniform with careful attention. Every badge and button shone brightly. He liked how powerful he looked in his uniform. The morning sun came through the window, making his badges shine even more. Today was important. He had to go to court to talk about a case. Another day of dealing with these people who think they know better than police officers, he said to himself, straightening his collar one last time. Lee had been a police officer for 15 years, and he was proud of his record. His superiors always praised him for being tough and direct. Some people complained about how he treated them, but he didn't care. He believed he was always right. The Metropolitan Courthouse was busy that morning. People walked quickly through the security gates, and lawyers carried heavy folders filled with papers. Officer Lee walked in like he owned the place. The security guards knew him. He came here often to testify in cases. "Good morning, Officer Lee," said one of the guards, moving to check his ID. "You know who I am, don't you?" Lee said with a slight frown. "I've been coming here for years." He walked past without showing his ID. The guard looked uncomfortable but didn't stop him. Near the courtroom, Lee saw his partner, Officer Park G1. Park was younger and had only worked with Lee for 6 months. He was waiting on a bench, looking nervous. "Why are you here so early?" Lee asked, checking his watch. "The hearing doesn't start for another hour." Park stood up quickly. "I wanted to tell you something important. The judge today is Kim Hae-yun. She's known for being very strict about respect in her courtroom." Lee laughed. "So what? I've dealt with all kinds of judges. They're all the same." A group of courthouse workers walked by, talking quietly among themselves. Lee heard one of them mention Judge Kim's name. He listened more carefully. Judge Kim made that rich businessman apologize in front of everyone last week. One worker said. He tried to talk down to her, and she put him in his place. "She's tough but fair," another added. "She treats everyone the same, no matter who they are." Lee shook his head and smiled. "They make her sound so special," he said to Park. "I've testified hundreds of times. I know how to handle myself in court." Park looked worried. "Just be careful, okay? This case is important." The case was about a drug arrest Lee had made 3 months ago. He had stopped a young man for looking suspicious and found drugs in his car. The man's lawyer was saying Lee had no good reason to stop him. Lee thought it was a waste of time. He knew a suspicious person when he saw one. More people arrived at the courthouse. The prosecutor, Choi Yuna, walked up to Lee and Park. She carried a thick folder and looked serious. "Officer Lee, can we go over your testimony one more time?" she asked. "I want to make sure we have all the details right." "We've been through this already," Lee said, waving his hand dismissively. "I know what I'm doing." Choi tried again. "Judge Kim likes everything to be very clear and organized. She'll want to know exactly why you stopped the defendant's car." "Because I'm good at my job," Lee said firmly. "I've been doing this longer than you've been a lawyer. Trust me." Choi looked at Park, who shrugged helplessly. She walked away, shaking her head slightly. Lee sat down on the bench and checked his phone. He had received many awards for his police work over the years. His arrest numbers were always high. Some people complained about his methods, but his bosses always supported him. They said he had good instincts. A young clerk came out of the courtroom. "Officer Lee, Judge Kim would like to review your incident report before the hearing starts." "She has it in the case file," Lee said, not looking up from his phone. "She wants to see it again," the clerk insisted politely. Lee sighed loudly and stood up. "Fine, but tell her she's wasting my time. I could be out on the streets doing real police work." The clerk's eyes widened at his words. Even Park looked shocked. "Lee, you can't talk like that about Judge Kim," Park warned. "She's not like other judges you've dealt with." "They're all the same," Lee repeated confidently. "They sit up there in their fancy robes, thinking they know everything. But we're the ones out there, every day, dealing with real criminals." More people gathered outside the courtroom. Lee noticed some of them looking at him and whispering. He stood taller, enjoying the attention. In his mind, they were probably talking about his reputation as a tough officer. The defendant's lawyer arrived, carrying a laptop and several files. She glanced at Lee and wrote something in her notebook. Lee remembered her from the arrest. She had complained about how he treated her client. "Court will begin in 15 minutes, announced a voice over the speaker system. Lee straightened his uniform again and touched his badges. He felt ready. No judge was going to question his judgment or his methods. He had been right to stop that car, and he would make everyone see that. "Officer Lee," Park said quietly, "please remember what I said about Judge Kim." "Stop worrying so much," Lee replied. "I know how to handle myself. These judges just need someone to stand up to them sometimes. They can't push me around." The courtroom doors opened. People began filing in slowly. Lee stayed where he was, wanting to be the last one to enter. He liked making an entrance. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Kim Hae-yun," came the announcement. Lee smiled to himself. He was about to show everyone how a real police officer handled court. Little did he know, this day would turn out very differently from what he expected. The next few minutes would change his career forever, though he didn't realize it yet. As he walked toward the courtroom doors, Lee was completely confident. He had no idea he was about to meet a judge who would shatter his arrogant worldview. The courtroom was quiet when Officer Lee Sung-ho walked in. Judge Kim Hae-yun sat behind her large desk, reading some papers through her glasses. She was wearing her black judge's robe, and her expression was serious. Lee noticed that she didn't look up when he entered, which bothered him. "Officer Lee Sung-ho, please approach the witness stand," the court clerk announced. Lee walked forward slowly, making his footsteps loud on purpose. He wanted everyone to notice his presence. As he passed the prosecutor's table, Choi Yuna gave him a warning look, but he ignored it. "Please raise your right hand," the clerk said. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "Yes, yes, of course," Lee said quickly before the clerk finished speaking. Some people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Kim looked up from her papers for the first time. Her dark eyes studied Lee carefully. "Officer Lee," she said in a clear, steady voice, "please wait for the clerk to finish the oath before responding." "Sorry, Your Honor," Lee said, but his tone showed he wasn't really sorry. "I've done this many times before. I know how it works." Judge Kim paused for a moment. "Then you should know better," she said quietly. "Let's start again." The clerk repeated the oath, and this time Lee waited until the end before saying, "I do." He sat down in the witness chair, leaning back as if he was relaxing in his living room. "Officer Lee," Judge Kim began, "please tell the court about the events of March 15th, when you stopped the defendant's vehicle." Lee smiled confidently. "Well, like I wrote in my report, I know a suspicious person when I see one. I've been doing this job for 15 years. "That's not what I asked," Judge Kim interrupted. "Please describe the specific reasons why you stopped the defendant's car." "Ma'am, with all due respect," Lee said, emphasizing the word ma'am, in a way that wasn't respectful at all. "When you've been on the streets as long as I have, you develop instincts." In the gallery, Officer Park Jae-won covered his face with his hands. The prosecutor, Choi Yuna, started writing something quickly in her notebook. Judge Kim removed her glasses slowly. "Officer Lee, this court is not interested in your instincts. We need facts. What specific behaviors or circumstances led you to stop this vehicle?" Lee shifted in his chair. "Like I said, I noticed suspicious behavior. The car was driving too carefully. Nobody drives that carefully unless they're hiding something." "Are you suggesting," Judge Kim said, her voice becoming firmer, "that following traffic laws is now grounds for suspicion?" Several people in the courtroom tried to hide their smiles. Lee felt his face getting warm. "That's not what I meant," he said, his voice getting louder. "Maybe if you had some experience in actual police work, you'd understand better." A gasp went through the courtroom. The defendant's lawyer sat up straighter, suddenly very interested. Judge Kim's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Officer Lee," she said calmly, "are you questioning this court's ability to understand police procedure?" "I'm just saying that some people might not fully appreciate the challenges we face out there," Lee replied, looking around the courtroom as if seeking support. He found none. "Let me be very clear," Judge Kim said. "This court has handled hundreds of cases involving police procedure. My role is to ensure that the law is followed by everyone, including police officers. Now, please answer my original question without commentary on this court's qualifications." Lee felt angry now. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. "The car was in a high-crime area," he said sharply. "That's reason enough." "According to the map submitted as evidence," Judge Kim said, picking up a paper, "this stop occurred in a residential neighborhood near a community college. Is that what you consider a high-crime area?" "Everywhere is potentially a high-crime area," Lee said. Some people in the courtroom laughed quietly, and he turned to glare at them. "Face forward when speaking to the court, Officer Lee," Judge Kim ordered. In the witness chair, unaware that his career was about to change dramatically in the next few minutes, Lee turned back, his jaw tight with anger. "I don't understand why my judgment is being questioned here. I made a good arrest. We found drugs in that car. After the fact, results do not justify an illegal stop," Judge Kim said. "You know this, Officer Lee. It's basic constitutional law." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Lee said, making the title sound like an insult, "maybe we should focus on the criminal here instead of examining every little detail of police work." Judge Kim set down her papers very carefully. The courtroom became so quiet that people could hear the clock ticking on the wall. "Officer Lee," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silence, "are you suggesting that this court should ignore proper police procedure and constitutional rights?" "I'm suggesting that some people spend too much time worrying about procedures and not enough time thinking about public safety," Lee said, sitting up straighter. "In my experience." "Your experience is not the law, Officer Lee," Judge Kim interrupted. "And this court is not interested in your opinions about how justice should be administered." Lee felt his control of the situation slipping away. He was used to people backing down when he pushed back, but Judge Kim wasn't backing down at all. "The defendant had drugs in his car," Lee said loudly. "That's what matters here." "Officer Lee, lower your voice," Judge Kim warned. "This is your final warning about proper courtroom behavior." "Final warning?" Lee laughed shortly. "I've testified in court dozens of times. I know what I'm doing." "Clearly, you don't," Judge Kim said. The words were simple, but they hit Lee like a physical force. "Your conduct today shows a disturbing lack of respect for this court and for the legal process itself." Lee saw his partner Park shaking his head in the gallery. The prosecutor was staring at her papers, refusing to look at him. But Lee couldn't stop himself now. Maybe if certain people spent some time on the streets dealing with real criminals instead of sitting in comfortable offices, they'd understand how things really work, he said. The words hung in the air like smoke. Judge Kim put her glasses back on very slowly and picked up a different set of papers from her desk. The defendant's lawyer was smiling now, writing rapidly in her notebook. "Officer Lee," Judge Kim said, her voice carrying a new tone that made Lee suddenly feel uncomfortable. "Since you seem so interested in how things really work, perhaps it's time we had a detailed discussion about proper police procedure and courtroom conduct." Lee realized, too late, that he had made a terrible mistake, but his pride wouldn't let him back down now. He sat. Judge Kim Hae-yun organized the papers on her desk with precise movements. The courtroom remained silent as she reviewed several documents, taking her time. Officer Lee Sung-ho sat in the witness chair, attempting to maintain his confident expression, but his discomfort was becoming visible. "Officer Lee," Judge Kim began, her voice measured and clear, "I have here your service record for the past 5 years. Would you like to know what I find particularly interesting about it?" Lee straightened his uniform collar. My arrest record is excellent, Your Honor. Everyone knows that. I am not concerned with your arrest numbers at this moment, Judge Kim responded. I am looking at the pattern of complaints filed against you regarding your conduct during traffic stops and arrests. The prosecutor, Choi Yuna, closed her eyes briefly. She had tried to warn Lee about this possibility, but he had refused to listen. In the gallery, Officer Park Ji-won leaned forward, concerned about what might come next. Complaints happen all the time, Lee said dismissively. Criminals always complain when they get caught. Judge Kim placed the document down carefully. Officer Lee, in the past 3 years, you have received 27 formal complaints about your conduct. 17 of these complaints specifically mention disrespectful behavior and apparent bias in your actions. Those complaints were dismissed, Lee interrupted. Officer Lee, Judge Kim said firmly, you will not interrupt this court. Furthermore, these complaints were not dismissed. They were marked as reviewed without action by your supervising officers. There is a significant difference. Lee shifted in his chair. The courtroom had become uncomfortably warm for him, though the temperature hadn't changed. Your Honor, he began, but Judge Kim held up her hand. I am not finished, she said. In addition to these complaints, I have reports from 3 other judges about your behavior in their courtrooms. Judge Park noted that you were, and I quote, dismissive and confrontational during your testimony last year. Lee's face reddened. That was a different situation. Indeed, Judge Kim continued. Every situation is different, Officer Lee, yet your behavior remains consistently problematic. This brings us to today's proceedings. She removed her glasses and looked directly at Lee. Your conduct in this courtroom has displayed a pattern of disrespect that I find deeply troubling. You have interrupted both myself and the court clerk. You have made disparaging remarks about the judicial process. Most concerning, you have repeatedly implied that your personal judgment should supersede established law. The defendant's lawyer was taking detailed notes. Lee noticed this and felt a surge of anger. Your Honor, I object to this treatment, he said loudly. I came here to testify about a valid arrest, not to be lectured about. Officer Lee, Judge Kim interrupted, her voice carrying a note of finality. You are now formally warned about contempt of court. If you continue this behavior, there will be serious consequences. Do you understand? Lee gripped the arms of the witness chair. Yes, Your Honor, he said through clenched teeth. Very well, Judge Kim continued. Now let us return to the matter of the traffic stop. Please explain, without editorial comments, what specific articulable facts led you to initiate this stop. Lee took a deep breath. The vehicle was traveling 5 miles below the speed limit. The driver appeared nervous when he passed my patrol car. And how did you determine the driver appeared nervous from inside your patrol car? I could tell, Lee said firmly. Like I said before, when you have my experience. Officer Lee, Judge Kim interrupted again. This is your second warning. You will provide specific, factual answers without references to your experience or personal opinions. Is that clear? In the gallery, several observers exchanged glances. They could see that Officer Lee was struggling to contain his growing frustration. His face had become flushed, and his hands were gripping the witness stand tightly. Crystal clear, Your Honor, Lee replied, his tone carrying an edge of sarcasm. Judge Kim made a note in her papers. Officer Lee, are you aware that driving below the speed limit, in itself, does not constitute probable cause for a traffic stop? Of course I know that, Lee said quickly. But when you combine it with other factors. What other factors? Judge Kim asked. Please be specific. Lee hesitated. The neighborhood. The time of day. The type of vehicle. The neighborhood, as we established earlier, was a residential area near a college campus. Judge Kim stated. The time was 3:30 in the afternoon. And the vehicle was a 4-year-old sit-in. Are you suggesting that these factors constitute reasonable suspicion of criminal activity? The defendant's lawyer smiled slightly. Officer Park in the gallery looked increasingly uncomfortable. Prosecutor Choi was writing rapidly in her notebook, her expression concerned. "Your Honor," Lee began, his voice rising again, "with all due respect." "Officer Lee," Judge Kim cut in. "I notice you use the phrase 'with all due respect' frequently. However, your tone and behavior suggest you do not, in fact, have any respect for this court or its procedures." Lee felt his control slipping further away. He was not used to being challenged like this, especially not in front of an audience. His usual tactics of asserting his authority and experience were not working. "I respect the law," he said firmly. "The law, Officer Lee, includes proper procedure, constitutional rights, and judicial oversight," Judge Kim replied. "It is not merely a tool for law enforcement to use as they see fit." The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Lee could feel sweat forming on his forehead. He looked around the courtroom, seeing only neutral or disapproving faces. Even his partner, Park, was now staring at the floor. "Now," Judge Kim continued, "I will ask you one more time about the specific, legally valid reasons for initiating this traffic stop. Please be advised that your answer will be evaluated solely on its legal merits, not on your personal beliefs about police work." Lee sat there, feeling trapped. His years of experience, his reputation, his usual confidence, none of it seemed to matter in this courtroom. Judge Kim waited patiently, her expression neutral but firm. What happened next would become a turning point in Officer Lee's career, though not in the way he expected. As he opened his mouth to respond, he made a decision that would lead to consequences he never anticipated. Officer Lee Sung-ho looked at Judge Kim Hae-yun and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of answering her question about the traffic stop, he chose to defend himself. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "I think we all know what's really happening here. Certain people in certain positions seem very eager to question the judgment of experienced police officers." The prosecutor, Choi Yun-ah, quickly stood up. "Your Honor, may we request a brief recess?" "Sit down, Prosecutor Choi," Judge Kim said quietly. "Officer Lee appears to have something he wishes to say to this court." She folded her hands on her desk and waited. Lee felt encouraged by the judge's attention. He thought she was finally going to listen to his side. He was very wrong. "I've served this city for 15 years, he continued, his voice getting louder. "I've made thousands of arrests. I've gotten drugs off our streets. But instead of appreciating that, certain people who've never worn a badge want to criticize how I do my job." Officer Park Ji-won, still sitting in the gallery, covered his face with both hands. The defendant's lawyer was writing so fast her pen could barely keep up. "Officer Lee," Judge Kim said calmly, "are you suggesting that this court's authority to review police conduct is somehow inappropriate?" "I'm suggesting that maybe if certain people spent less time in their comfortable chambers and more time on the streets, they'd understand how real police work gets done," Lee replied, emphasizing the words "certain people" in a way that made several people in the courtroom gasp. Judge Kim removed her glasses slowly and placed them on her desk. The courtroom became so quiet that everyone could hear the traffic outside. "Officer Lee," she said, her voice carrying a new tone that made even Lee pause, "when you say certain people, exactly whom are you referring to?" Lee realized he might have gone too far, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "I think we all know what I mean, Your Honor." "Indeed," Judge Kim replied. She picked up a folder from her desk. "Officer Lee, are you familiar with the case of Thompson versus Harrison County?" "I don't need to know about old court cases," Lee said dismissively. "I know how to do my job." "The Thompson case," Judge Kim continued as if he hadn't spoken, "established clear guidelines about discriminatory police practices. It was decided by Judge Maria Rodriguez, who served 20 years as a police officer before becoming a judge." Lee shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Or perhaps," Judge Kim went on, "you'd prefer to discuss the Martinez decision." That ruling on proper traffic stop procedures was written by Judge Robert Chin, who spent 15 years as a beat cop in Detroit before attending law school. The courtroom was completely silent now. Everyone watched as Judge Kim opened another folder. "Your Honor, I didn't mean," Lee began, but Judge Kim held up her hand. "Officer Lee, in the past hour, you have demonstrated a pattern of behavior that this court finds deeply troubling. You have shown disrespect not only for this court, but for the entire judicial system. Your comments have repeatedly suggested that certain groups of people are less qualified to uphold the law." Lee's face had turned red. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Furthermore," Judge Kim continued, "your personnel file shows 7 previous incidents where you were counseled about similar behavior. 3 different judges have noted your disrespectful conduct in their courtrooms. Yet you continue to display the same inappropriate attitudes." She picked up another document. "Last month, you told Judge Anderson that he couldn't understand real police work because he had only practiced criminal law for 20 years. 2 weeks ago, you told a female police sergeant that she got her promotion through special consideration. Last week, you informed a public defender that she should stick to easier cases." Lee's confidence was crumbling. He hadn't known that all these incidents had been documented. His partner, Park, was now staring at him with a mixture of disappointment and embarrassment. "Your Honor, I can explain," Lee started, but his voice sounded weak even to himself. "Officer Lee," Judge Kim said, her voice becoming even more formal, "this court has listened to your explanations. We have heard your opinions about who is and is not qualified to question your judgment. Now this court will speak, and you will listen." She stood up slowly, her black robes making her seem taller. Every person in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath. "In my 27 years of legal practice," Judge Kim began, "I have worked as a public defender, a prosecutor, and now a judge. I have handled over 3,000 criminal cases. I have worked with hundreds of police officers, most of whom understand and respect the legal system they serve." She paused, looking directly at Lee. "But occasionally, I encounter someone who believes that their badge places them above the law. Someone who thinks their personal prejudices should carry more weight than constitutional rights. Someone who, despite repeated warnings, continues to demonstrate contempt for the very system they claim to serve." Lee felt sweat running down his back. The courtroom seemed to be spinning slightly. He had never felt so completely out of control of a situation. "Officer Lee," Judge Kim continued, "your conduct today has demonstrated precisely why judicial oversight of police conduct is not just necessary, but essential. Your attitude reveals exactly why we have constitutional protections against arbitrary police action. In fact, you have provided this court with a perfect example of why the entire system of checks and balances exists." The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Lee could feel every eye in the courtroom on him. His usual confidence had completely disappeared, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Judge Kim picked up her gavel, and Lee realized that something very serious was about to happen. He had pushed too far, and now he was about to learn exactly what consequences meant in Judge Kim's courtroom. Judge Kim Hae-yun held her gavel firmly as she prepared to deliver her decision. Officer Lee Sung-ho sat very still in the witness chair, his earlier confidence completely gone. The courtroom remained silent, waiting for what would come next. "Before I proceed with my ruling," Judge Kim began, "I want the record to clearly show the events that have brought us to this moment." She picked up a document and began to read. "Today, Officer Lee has demonstrated persistent disrespect for this court. He has interrupted proceedings multiple times. He has made discriminatory comments about judicial authority. He has refused to provide direct answers to simple questions. Most seriously, he has shown complete disregard for proper legal procedures and constitutional rights." Lee stared at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. His partner, Park Ji-won, watched sadly from the gallery. "Furthermore," Judge Kim continued, "Officer Lee's behavior today is not an isolated incident. His record shows a clear pattern of similar conduct. This court cannot and will not ignore such behavior from a sworn officer of the law. She paused and looked directly at Lee. Officer Lee, please stand. Lee stood up slowly, his legs feeling weak. The proud stance he had shown earlier was gone. This court finds you in contempt, Judge Kim announced. You are hereby fined $5,000. This fine must be paid from your personal funds, not from any police union or department resources. Lee's face turned pale. This was more serious than he had expected. Additionally, Judge Kim continued, you are ordered to attend 40 hours of sensitivity training and constitutional law education. These sessions will be conducted by qualified instructors chosen by this court, not by the police department. The prosecutor, Choi Yuna, was writing quickly, documenting every word. The defendant's lawyer had stopped writing and was simply watching with satisfaction. This court is also ordering a complete review of your last 50 arrests, Judge Kim declared. Each case will be examined for potential bias or constitutional violations. Any cases found to have such issues will be reopened for review. Lee felt his knees weaken. 50 cases reviewed meant 50 chances for problems to be found. His perfect record was about to change. Furthermore, Judge Kim said, her voice becoming even more formal, I am sending a detailed report of today's events to your supervising officers, the police chief, and the Civilian Oversight Board. This report will include transcripts of your testimony and copies of all previous complaints against you. Officer Park watched as his partner seemed to shrink in his uniform. The badges that Lee had polished so carefully that morning no longer seemed to shine. Finally, Judge Kim said, you are suspended from testifying in any court in this jurisdiction for 90 days. During this time, you will complete your required training and demonstrate a clear understanding of proper legal procedures and courtroom conduct. She picked up her gavel. Let me be very clear, Officer Lee. Your behavior today has shown this court exactly why judicial oversight of police conduct is essential. You have demonstrated precisely why we have systems in place to check the authority of law enforcement. Lee stood there, completely speechless. Everything he had built his career on, his reputation, his authority, his way of doing things, was crumbling around him. This court respects the difficult and dangerous work that police officers do, Judge Kim continued. But that respect must go both ways. When officers show contempt for the law they are sworn to uphold, they undermine the very system they claim to serve. She looked around the courtroom, making sure everyone understood the importance of this moment. The law applies to everyone equally, she said firmly. No badge, no position, and no amount of experience places anyone above the law. This court will not tolerate discrimination, disrespect, or disregard for constitutional rights from any person, especially not from those sworn to uphold the law. Judge Kim raised her gavel. Officer Lee, you are dismissed from this court. You will report to the clerk's office immediately to begin processing your contempt citation. The sensitivity training schedule will be sent to your department within 24 hours. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom. Lee stood frozen for a moment, then slowly turned to leave. As he walked past the gallery, he saw his partner Park shaking his head. One more thing, Officer Lee, Judge Kim called out. Lee stopped but didn't turn around. When you return to this court after your suspension, I expect to see a very different attitude. Your record will be watched very carefully from now on. Lee walked out of the courtroom, his footsteps no longer loud and confident. The courthouse workers who had whispered about Judge Kim that morning watched him leave, their expressions a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy. Back in the courtroom, Judge Kim returned to the original case. Now, regarding the motion to suppress evidence from Officer Lee's traffic stop, given his testimony and the clear lack of probable cause, this court has no choice but to grant the motion. The evidence is suppressed. The defendant's lawyer smiled and closed her notebook. The prosecutor, Choi, began packing up her files, knowing the case was effectively over. Outside the courthouse, Lee sat in his patrol car staring at the steering wheel. His phone buzzed, probably his supervisor wanting to discuss Judge Kim's upcoming report. For the first time in his 15-year career, Officer Lee Sung-ho realized that being right wasn't the same as doing right, and that respect had to be earned, not demanded. The autumn sun was setting behind the courthouse as Lee finally started his car. He had a lot to think about, and a lot to learn, before he would return to Judge Kim's courtroom. Sometimes the hardest lessons were the ones we needed most, and today, Lee had learned his.